July 24th, 1944, 6:30, 5 in the morning. On a one-lane road outside a Normandy village called St. Martin des Brooms, an old blacksmith rolled a 200-pound anvil into the middle of the road and stopped 44 American fuel trucks cold. No rifle, no barricade team, no German patrol hiding in the hedges, just one man in a leather apron, one iron anvil, and a road narrow enough that the convoy had to obey him. Behind him were 180 villagers, a spring house, and a stone arch built in 1692. Ahead of him were thousands of gallons of gasoline meant for an armored column that had already outrun its supply line. The lieutenant in the first jeep told him there was a war on. The blacksmith nodded. Then he put one boot on the anvil and did not move. The convoy sat there for 5 hours, and when the field colonel finally heard what was blocking his fuel, he did not order the man dragged away. He asked for the route map. He asked for the truck weights. Then he got into a jeep and drove to the village himself. Because the strange thing about armies is this: they can move faster than any machine on earth, until the ground says no. For 4 years, St. Martin des Brooms had learned to survive by measuring danger in inches. An inch of flour missing from a sack, an inch of candle left after curfew, an inch of curtain open when German boots passed the lane. The people there had no factories, no depot, no rail yard worth bombing. On military maps, their village was a gray smudge between larger names, but to the people who lived there, it was everything. The spring house fed the public trough. The stone arch carried the only paved road over the channel that drained the fields. The church wall leaned so close to the lane that 2 wagons could not pass without one wheel kissing the curb. And for 2 centuries, every heavy cart that crossed that arch had crossed slowly, with someone walking beside it, watching the stone. The Americans did not know that. They were not careless men, they were tired men. By late July 1944, the Allied advance was no longer being limited by courage. It was being limited by fuel, tires, bridges, and roads that had been designed for horses. A fuel convoy did not feel like history from the driver's seat. It felt like orders. It felt like a route card folded against the steering wheel. It felt like a line of trucks trying to keep enough distance not to collide and enough speed not to fall behind. 3 days earlier, a different convoy had gone through the village of Weiermont, 6 miles west. One truck took a corner too wide and clipped the side of an old culvert. The culvert did not collapse all at once. It cracked, slumped, and broke later that afternoon under a wagon full of milk cans. By nightfall, Weiermont's drainage ditch had backed into the road. By morning, 2 cellars were flooded. The Americans never saw it. They were already 20 miles east. But Henri Leclerc saw it. Leclerc was 61 years old, the village blacksmith of St. Martin, des Brooms, and a man who had spent his entire life listening to things before they failed. A loose iron rim on a wagon wheel had a sound. A cracked hinge had a sound. A tired stone arch had a sound too, if you knew the village well enough to hear silence where there should have been weight. He visited Weiermont after the culvert broke. He helped men lift stones out of the water. He watched an old woman carry 2 buckets through mud because her cellar was ruined and her bread oven had gone cold. That evening he returned to St. Martin and stood under the village arch with one hand against the stone. He did not make a speech. He did not call a meeting at dawn on July 24th. He walked to his forge, rolled the anvil out on a handcart, and placed it across the road where the lane narrowed between the spring house and the church wall. Then he waited. The first jeep stopped 12 feet from the anvil. Lieutenant Robert Keene was 25 from Ohio and had been awake for almost 30 hours. He could see the blacksmith. He could see the anvil. He could see no enemy. That made the situation worse. Not better. He climbed out with a phrase book in one hand and a route order in the other. The conversation took 40 minutes. Keene understood 3 things immediately. First, Leclerc was not confused. Second, Leclerc was not afraid. Third, Leclerc would not allow a loaded fuel truck onto the stone arch unless someone with authority accepted responsibility for what happened after the wheels crossed. Keene promised slow speed. Leclerc shook his head. Keane promised a guide. Leclerc pointed to the arch. Keane explained the gasoline was needed forward before noon. Leclerc looked past him at the line of trucks and said, in broken English, "Then the army should have come sooner." By 9 o'clock, the convoy commander had called battalion. By 10, battalion had called regiment. By 11:30, the delay had reached a field headquarters where Colonel Miles Avery was being told that 40 fuel trucks were stopped by a civilian with a piece of shop equipment. Avery listened to the report without interrupting. Then he asked one question: "How old is the bridge?" The answer came back uncertain. 17th century. Maybe older. Avery folded the map, jet the weight sheets. 40 minutes later, his jeep rolled into St. Martin des Brooms. By then, the convoy had become its own temporary village. Drivers slept against tires. Men ate cold rations out of cans. A sergeant had started keeping a handwritten list of trucks that were burning fuel while carrying fuel, because that was the kind of joke logistics made possible. When Avery arrived, the men stood. Leclerc did not. He kept one boot against the anvil and watched the colonel approach. Avery was not Pat. He was not a man made for posters. He had a narrow face, mud on his cuffs, and the permanent impatience of an officer whose day was measured in gallons lost per hour. But he had one gift that made him valuable in a war of roads. He knew when the map was lying. With Avery was Corporal Thomas Renaud, a Louisiana radio operator whose family still spoke French at home. Avery gave him one instruction: translate exactly, not politely exactly. Then Avery looked at Leclerc. "Tell him I understand he is protecting the arch." Renaud translated. Leclerc nodded once. "Tell him I have 44 trucks carrying fuel that men ahead of us need today." Leclerc listened. He nodded again. Then he answered. Renaud looked at Avery. "He says gasoline can be replaced. The arch cannot." The drivers nearest the front heard that and went quiet. Avery turned toward the spring house. The arch was smaller than he expected. Not dramatic, not grand. Just old stone, damp underneath, the edges dark from centuries of water and shade. The road crossed it at an angle, so the heaviest rear wheels would not roll straight over the crown. They would twist. Avery did not need a village story to understand that. He needed one look. Ask him where the carts go when the spring floods? Leclerc's expression changed. That was the first question no officer had asked him. He pointed north, past a line of apple trees, toward a lane that looked more like a scar in the grass than a road. Avery and Leclerc walked it together, not fast, not ceremonially, just two practical men reading the ground. The orchard lane bent around the village and crossed a shallow ditch on two timber sleepers. It was too narrow for every truck, but it could take the empty jeeps, the maintenance vehicles, and the lighter loads. The fuel trucks were the problem. Their weight had to stay off the arch, but the spring house lane was still the only way through. At the far end of the village, Avery stopped and made his decision. The heaviest trucks would be unloaded before the arch. Fuel cans would be passed by hand over the stone crossing and reloaded on the far side. It would cost 2 hours of labor. It would save the arch. The lighter trucks would use the orchard lane. Every vehicle that did cross the village would move at walking speed with two villagers guiding the wheels. Leclerc would choose the guides. American soldiers would not touch the spring house, the church wall, or the arch. Leclerc listened to the translation for the first time that morning. He looked tired. Then he asked the question every man there remembered. "Why did you come yourself?" Renaud translated. Avery did not answer quickly. The convoy waited behind him. The war waited ahead of him, somewhere east. An armored column was burning fuel it did not have. But the colonel looked at the stone arch, then at the blacksmith, and said, "Because, if I make a promise about another man's village, he should hear it from me." Leclerc held his eyes for a long moment. Then he walked back to the anvil and rolled it out of the road himself. The convoy took 3 hours and 10 minutes to clear St. Martin des Brooms. The fuel cans went hand to hand across the arch. The lighter trucks rattled through the orchard lane. Farmers stood beside American drivers and called out when a wheel drifted too close to a curb. Not one stone cracked. Not one wall was clipped. Not one drop of spring water was lost. Before Avery's Jeep left, Leclerc handed him a horseshoe still warm from the forge. No speech. No salute. Just iron passed from one working hand to another. Avery took it, nodded, and drove east. That should have been the whole story. A blacksmith stopped an army. A colonel listened. The convoy moved, but 3 miles beyond St. Martin, the road entered a low stretch of Normandy. The quartermasters had already begun calling Ash Hollow. And Ash Hollow did not care about promises. Ash Hollow was 11 miles of soft pasture, damaged drainage, and chalky roadbed that looked firm until weight sat on it. The first convoy to try it lost 2 trucks before lunch. The second made it through after 7 hours and left ruts deep enough for a man to stand in. The third turned back when the lead vehicle sank to the axle and the fuel cans began floating in the ditch. There were no German tanks in Ash Hollow, no artillery, no mines anyone could find. The enemy was pressure. Too much weight on too little road over ground that had been wet since spring. Major Clarence Ellison, the senior engineer assigned to that sector, had a correct solution. He wanted pierced steel planking brought forward, the worst sections graded, culverts cleared, side drains cut, and a controlled one-way traffic system installed. It would work. It would also take 8 days and materials that were already promised to 3 bridge sites. Ellison submitted the plan anyway, because good engineers do not pretend mud is easier than it is. Lieutenant Samuel Granger read the plan and agreed with every calculation except the only one that mattered. Time Granger was 27. A civil engineering graduate who still looked too young for the authority he needed. He had been given a survey team, a Jeep with a cracked windshield, and an order to measure every place Ash Hollow was failing. He did more than measure. He walked it. For 2 days, he moved along the road with a probrod, a notebook, and boots that never dried. He marked the bad sections. He marked the flow of water under the road. He marked where the chalk held, where it sheared, where the old cart tracks crossed the pasture without sinking. That was the detail that would not leave him alone. The local farmers crossed the same wet ground every harvest with apple carts and hay wagons. They did not use steel. They did not wait 8 days. They used woven hazel hurdles, flat panels of interlaced wood, rough as barn gates, light enough for 2 men to carry. The farmers laid them over soft ground in pairs, packed ash and broken stone between them, then moved the carts before the soil could drink the weight downward. It was not modern. It was not elegant. It was not in the manual. It was, however, still there in the wheel marks. Granger drew the cross-section in his notebook that night. Hazel hurdle, ash fill, broken chalk, second hurdle perpendicular, tamped surface, one-way crossing under guided speed. He calculated the load spread 3 ways and came up with a number he did not trust until he did it again. Then he did it a 3rd time. By morning he had 12 pages, 3 sketches, and a proposal for a temporary tracked surface that could be built with local material and unskilled labor in under 48 hours. R.S. Ellison read the first 4 pages. Then he set them down. "Lieutenant," he said, "you are proposing that I fix an American Army road with baskets." Granger stood still. "With load. Distributing wattle panels, sir." "That is a basket with ambition." The captain in the corner laughed once and stopped when Ellison looked at him. Granger kept going. "Sir, the steel plan is better, but it is not faster. We only need the surface to hold long enough for controlled transits until the permanent works catch up." Ellison tapped the paper. "You put a loaded 6 by 6 over farm fencing on saturated ground, and the first time it fails, we do not lose an experiment. We lose fuel, trucks, and men. Then test it under load before we open it. We have a plan." 8 days, sir." Ellison's voice hardened. "We have a plan. That should have ended it. In most armies it would have." But the delay at St. Martin had already moved through the sector in whispers. Not the way headquarters wrote it, the way drivers told it. A blacksmith stopped the fuel. The colonel walked the ground. The arch held. Captain Ruth Calder heard the story while standing over a fuel ledger at 2 in the morning. She was a logistics officer, which meant she believed in miracles only after they had been counted twice and entered in pencil. She asked for Granger's survey. She read it. Then she did the one thing Ellison had not done. She compared the method to the fuel curve. Every day, Ash Hollow stayed restricted. Forward delivery dropped by an estimated 22%. By the 4th day, 2 armored battalions would be rationing movement. By the 6th, artillery ammunition would reach the front slower than the guns could fire it. By the 8th, the official solution would arrive just in time to explain why the advance had stopped. Calder took the survey to Brigadier General Hugh Mallory before breakfast. She did not sell the idea as clever. She sold it as arithmetic. Mallory asked Granger one question. If it fails, does it make the road worse? No, sir. The panels can be pulled. The steel plan still works. How long for a trial? 20. For hours for the first section. Mallory looked at Ellison. Ellison's face did not move. Mallory said, "You supervise. If it fails under load, it stops." The test began in rain. Of course it did. Ash Hollow had the decency of a bad problem. It showed itself at its worst. At first light, Granger had 20 men cutting hazel from an overgrown coppice along the field edge. French farmers showed them how to split the rods without shattering them. By noon, the first panels were finished, crude but tight. Each panel was 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. The first layer went lengthwise across the soft road. Ash fill went over it. Broken chalk was shoveled into the gaps. The second layer crossed the first. Then came more fill and a tamping roller made from a steel drum filled with rubble. It looked ridiculous. It looked fragile. It looked exactly like the sort of thing soldiers insulted until it worked. At 1600, Granger called for the lightest truck. The driver leaned out the window and stared at the surface. "You sure about this, Lieutenant?" Granger was not sure. That was the part nobody wrote down later. He had numbers. He had field marks. He had local proof. But certainty is what people claim after a thing survives. Before that, all you have is the work. "First gear," Granger said. "Walking speed. Do not stop." The truck rolled forward. The panels compressed. Mud squeezed up along the edges. Every man on the road stopped breathing. The front wheels crossed, then the rear. Then the truck climbed onto firm road on the other side. Surface deflection, less than 3 inches. Ellison walked onto the mat himself, pressed one boot at the seam, and said nothing. Then he called for a loaded fuel truck. The loaded truck weighed more than twice as much. It crossed in 90 seconds. The surface dipped 5 inches and held. Ellison looked at Granger for a long time. Then he pulled out his notebook. "Build the next 30 yards, he said, "and tighten your panel spacing." That was as close to praise as Ellison got. By midnight, Ash Hollow had 1 working section. By the next evening, it had 3. By July 27th, the first full fuel convoy moved through in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The previous successful transit had taken nearly 8 hours. No truck sank. No fuel was lost. The drivers began calling it the Hurdle Road before anyone in headquarters had a chance to give it a worse name, but a working solution creates a new danger. People copy it before they understand it. Within 48 hours, 3 other units tried to build Hurdle Road surfaces from Granger's notes. One made the panels too loose. One skipped the ash fill. One let a driver stop halfway across the soft section, which was exactly how a temporary surface became a trap. A truck broke through near La Feuille at dusk on July 29th. No one died, but it took 6 hours to winch out, and 6 hours in logistics is not a delay. It is a wound that spreads. Ellison came to Granger that night. He held the failure report in one hand. "The method works," Ellison said. "The instructions do not." Granger already knew. A technique that lives in a man's hands has not become a system. It is only a performance being repeated by memory. To become useful, it had to survive other people. So Granger stopped being an inventor and became a teacher. He trained 8-man road teams in the rain, in the dark, beside roads that were already failing. Probe first, mark the wet line, lay the panels tight, fill the voids, cross the second layer, tamp until the sound changes, test light, test loaded, never stop a vehicle on the mat, never let pride add speed. He repeated those rules until men were mouthing them with him. Calder turned them into a 1-page field card. Ellison added diagrams. Mallory signed the authorization. By August 3rd, the hurdle road method was moving through the sector faster than the trucks it was saving. That was when the Germans noticed. They had been watching supply routes with the patience of men who understood that an army does not need to be defeated everywhere. It only needs to be starved in one place long enough for the front to feel it. Reports reached a German rear, a RIA intelligence cell, that American convoys were no longer bogging in Ash Hollow. The explanation sounded absurd. Woven farm panels, hazel rods, ash and chalk. A road made from things French peasants had been using for generations. The first German response was practical. Burn the coppices near the supply roads. Destroy loose hazel. Cut the orchard lanes. Deny the raw material. Over 2 nights, small rearguard teams burned hedges and panel stacks in 3 locations. The smoke was visible from the convoy routes at dawn. The second response was more personal. A captured report later showed that they had identified the young engineer officer attached to the road teams, not by full biography, not by brilliance, just by function. Find the man teaching the road method. Stop him. Granger never knew how close they came. On August 5th, he changed his route because one training team had made their panels too wide to turn around a barn corner. He stayed to fix it. The German team waiting near the next crossing left after 40 minutes when an American patrol appeared. 40 minutes. That was the margin between a field method becoming a protocol and becoming a story about a dead lieutenant with a good idea. The Germans could burn hazel. They could not burn the habit once it spread. Farmers brought split apple wood. A cooper donated barrel staves. A church roof repair crew brought bundles of lath. None of it was perfect. All of it could work if the load spread, the voids filled, and the crossing stayed controlled. That was the truth hiding inside the method. The material was not the miracle. The discipline was, on August 9th. That discipline saved a convoy that mattered. A fuel and ammunition column, 52 vehicles long, reached a low crossing near Montreal-sur-Vire before sunrise. Rain had come hard overnight. The lead scouts found 2 soft sections where the chalk road was beginning to shear away from the drainage ditch. The convoy commander was Captain Daniel Beckett. He was not Granger. He had attended one of Granger's training sessions 6 days earlier, and spent most of it thinking the lieutenant looked too tired to be trusted. Now he stood in the rain with a probe rod in his hand, and heard Granger's voice in his head. Probe first. Mark the wet line. Never let pride add speed. Beckett stopped the convoy. That decision cost him immediate anger from every driver behind him and probably saved the column. For 35 minutes, men cut panels from whatever straight wood they could find. For 20 more, they laid, filled, crossed, tamped, and tested. At 0520, the lead truck moved onto the first temporary mat. At 0715, the full column reached the forward supply point. By noon, the guns that supply column fed were firing again. A German rearguard commander wrote in his log that afternoon, "Road failure expected. American movement continues. 'Cause uncertain. 'Cause uncertain." That was the phrase. Not bravery, not luck, not overwhelming force. 'Cause uncertain. A blacksmith had known an arch better than a convoy map. A lieutenant had trusted wheel marks over a manual. A logistics captain had trusted arithmetic over embarrassment. A skeptical major had changed his mind when the load test proved him wrong. And hundreds of tired men had done the ugly work of making a simple idea repeatable. By the end of August 1944, The hurdle road method had been used on 71 temporary crossings and soft sections across the Normandy rear area and the western supply routes. More than 3,800 vehicle movements cross surfaces built from local wood, ash, chalk, and disciplined labor. There were failures. 11 serious ones. Everyone traced back to one of three causes: loose panel weave, insufficient fill, or a vehicle stopping under load. After the training cards reached the units, none of those failures closed a route for more than 2 hours. The official reports gave the method a dry name: expedient waddle, panel ground reinforcement. Drivers kept calling it hurdle road. Granger was promoted in September. The citation was short. Ellison wrote it himself. He did not apologize for the first meeting. Men like Ellison did not apologize easily, especially when they were only half wrong, but he included one sentence that mattered. Lieutenant Granger's field observation converted local agricultural practice into a repeatable military transit method under combat supply conditions. That was Ellison admitting the thing in the only language he trusted. Granger went east with the army. He kept measuring roads. He kept finding the places where official certainty broke against physical truth. He kept a folded copy of the field card in his map case until it fell apart at the seams. After the war, he went home and built county roads. Not famous roads, not bridges with bronze plaques, county roads. The kind people notice only when they fail. He married a schoolteacher in 1948, raised 3 children, took jobs in places where the soil was stubborn, and the budget was worse. He became known as the engineer who could make a road hold without making it expensive. When people asked where he learned that, he said Normandy taught him to look down. That was usually all. The Army kept the method in a manual appendix. 1 paragraph, 2 diagrams. No anvil, no blacksmith, no orchard lane, no rain in Ash Hollow, no horseshoe passed through the window of a muddy Jeep, no mention of Captain Calder counting fuel losses under a lamp at 2 in the morning, no mention of Ellison standing on a woven road surface in the rain, notebook in hand trying to decide whether the thing he had dismissed was now evidence. And almost, even that appendix disappeared. In March 1945, a review board in Washington began cleaning up field-expedient techniques that had entered use without formal testing. Hurdle road was on the list. The language was administrative, not hostile, suspend pending validation, 4 to 6 months. In an office far from Normandy mud, that sounded reasonable. In the field, it would have meant removing a working method during the final months of a war still being supplied over damaged roads. The suspension order was drafted. It was never sent. The officer assigned to transmit, it was moved to another section during preparations for the Rhine crossings. His replacement reviewed the outgoing papers, saw that the method had been in active use for months, without major incident, and wrote one note across the file: defer until theater command requests review. The file went into a drawer. The war moved on. That is how close some useful things come to vanishing. Not because an enemy destroys them, not because the idea fails, because a form moves across a desk at the wrong hour. Henri Leclerc died in 1952. His obituary called him a blacksmith, a father, and a respected man of St. Martin-d'Es brooms. It did not mention the anvil in the road. Samuel Granger died decades later after building more miles of rural road than he ever counted. His obituary mentioned military service and civil engineering. It did not mention Ash Hollow. Captain Calder's papers, discovered years after her death, contained one folded field card with mud still pressed into the crease. Major Ellison's copy of Granger's original proposal had one annotation in the margin beside the first sketch of the wattle panels. It said simply, "Works when built correctly." That might be the most honest memorial an engineer ever wrote, because the lesson was never that old methods are better than new ones. They are not. The lesson was never that villagers know everything, and officers know nothing. They do not. The lesson was sharper than that. The ground does not care who outranks whom. Stone does not care who is in a hurry. Mud does not care what the manual says, and a good army, like a good engineer, survives by learning fast enough when the world refuses to match the plan. In St. Martin, that lesson looked like an anvil in the road. Ode in Ash Hollow, it looked like woven hazel under a fuel truck. In Washington, it looked like a suspension order that never left the drawer. 3 small interruptions. 3 moments when the largest machine in the world had to slow down, listen, and admit that the answer was already under its wheels. The road held because somebody finally looked down,